What I'm going to talk about for a few minutes is the story of the Flying Dutchman. I've come across a number of people who've never heard of it, so it'll be news to them, and to some people they've got a vague memory of what happened. But there were two Dutchmen who flew from the Netherlands East Indies to Australia, and their aim was to fly around Australia. So that was the two gentlemen in their holiday and picnic gear. One of them was Wim Rouse. He was a businessman from Batavia who had the agency for de Havilland Aircraft. Alongside of him is Hugo van Beckham, and he had an agency for motor cars. And both businesses worked fairly well. Both people had a private licence, and they thought that they would put it to good use by flying around Australia. So they flew from Bandung, positioned themselves to cross the Timor Sea, and landed at Wyndham, where they went through customs and then decided to come down the West Australian coast. They were in the Hornet Moth, and that was owned by Wim. And so they came down the WA coast and had 2 days off in Port Hedland, where they did some fishing and shooting, and then came down to Maylands, and then had a day in Perth, prepared their aircraft for the crossing of the Nullarbor. First, they were going to go to Kalgoorlie, and second, on to Forest. That was going to be their first day's journey across Australia. And so it was on a Wednesday morning that they set out, and the forecast wasn't particularly good. But nevertheless, they persevered. When they got to somewhere around about Southern Cross, the weather started to deteriorate. It got so bad with rain, cloud, hail, and a strong crosswind, and limited views of the terrain, and the very poor maps that were available at the time. It wasn't long before they had no idea where they were. So they continued on until they felt that they were stretching their fuel a bit, and they made the decision which left them well off their original track. They landed on the edge of a salt lake. Not quite sure where they were, but they sat it out and had a very uncomfortable night. The only food they had was some sandwiches and coffee, which they'd taken with them to have at Kalgoorlie on the way to Forest. It wasn't a big lunch, just a light one, picnic lunch. So they spent an uncomfortable night in the Hornet on the edge of the lake. The next day, on the Thursday, they heard an aircraft to the north of them. And they thought, well, if that aircraft is to the north, it probably is where there'll be some settlement, and maybe we should think of going a bit further north than we are. On that photo you can see the aircraft on the edge of the lake there. And so to get the best out of their fuel, what they did was measure it, and they discovered that they had 2.5 gallons left. Not a lot. To make it go as far as possible and extend their range, they took out all of their excessive weight to get the best performance out of the aircraft. So they unloaded their baggage and any excessive weight and material that they could. So there really was just them in their lightweight gear. They then took off to look for help, and as their fuel became less and less, they decided that they would land on a second lake. So that's the aircraft on the second lake. And they spent a very uncomfortable night because they didn't have any extra clothes. Their baggage had been left behind on the first lake. And so they were virtually out of food and water by this stage, and food and fluids. But they did have a bag of sugar cubes, which were to go into the coffee. And so they limited themselves to a sugar cube every half day. Meanwhile, There was plenty of action going on in the background. I'm amazed at the number of people who lent a hand in this particular case. You probably wouldn't find anything like it today. Maybe communication wasn't as good in those days. It wasn't. And so lots of duplication took place. By Wednesday afternoon, when the aircraft had not arrived at Kalgoorlie, the news was broadcast on local radio and it spread among the population. The Shell Oil Company moved in very quickly, and by having communication with outlying towns and people, they got on the phone and rang as many as they could on Friday afternoon and Friday evening. They started to get reports, widespread, as to people who had seen the aircraft, people who had heard the aircraft, or people who thought they'd heard the aircraft. By Wednesday night, they'd sent out a couple of land parties to look for the aircraft in areas where it was reported to have been seen, but they proved to be fruitless. And so reports came in from all sorts of places, numerous, and many of them obviously in error. There were fettlers out on the railway line who were feeding information in. There were woodcutters feeding information, woodcarters, and people at villages and towns at various places. On Thursday morning, quite early, George Lewis. How many of you know George Lewis's name? Okay, well, he was the man who set up Goldfields Airways in about 1933 or so, and became a very popular person in the area. So he set out in his Foxmoth and covered the area out as far as Rawlinna. He carried an observer on the aircraft with a pair of binoculars, and so as well as tracking parallel to the railway line and south of it, they observed further south with the binoculars and up to the railway line through the binoculars as well. He returned to Kalgoorlie by roughly midday and tried to work out what was going on and couldn't come to any conclusion. In Perth, and quite off his own bat, a man by the name of Viv James decided that he would help, and so he left Maylands in his aircraft in a gypsy mob. He got to Kalgoorlie around about midday, and does anyone know the name Viv James?
Did he have the bus company?
No, he had James taxi planes and taxis. He was also a candid photographer in London Court, and they used to have soapbox speakers on the Esplanade, and he was one of those, quite an outgoing person. Anyway, he got to Kalgoorlie about midday. When George Lewis got back, they had a discussion on how they could, as a pair, do some good, so they worked to a plan. They also planned their Friday search. Late on Thursday, the Defence Department announced that they would take charge of the search, and they sent 2 Demon aircraft from the east, but they hadn't really calculated it was going to take 2 or 3 days for the Demons to get to Kalgoorlie. So this is Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and by the time they got searching on Sunday, it probably would have been too late. But anyway, they took off and headed for Kalgoorlie. The locals were not convinced about the effect of the Demons, and so they continued with their own plans. Lewis and James continued their search in the vicinity of Kalgoorlie. They actually came across a fire out along the railway line, the trans line, and did a search of it, thinking that they'd probably find the wreckage of an aeroplane, but there was no wreckage there. It seemed to be a fire left over by some Aborigines who were doing some cooking. By Friday morning, there was still no positive news. People started to get a little bit worried about whether these aviators were going to survive or not. In Perth, some others decided to help, and one was Charlie Snook. in a Simmons Spartan. Also, Jimmy Woods in a de Havilland Dragon set out for Kalgoorlie. This aircraft was hired by the Civil Aviation Board, and on board was a bloke called Frank Colomby, who was really the department's man in Western Australia, and there was another man on board who was the aviation correspondent for WA newspapers, and that was a bloke called Bob Giles. Who knows the name Bob Giles? We had a library here called the R.O. Giles Library on stage. They flew to Kalgoorlie, and by late in the day they worked out a plan for how they would handle things on Saturday. On Saturday, James was allocated some area to the north. George Lewis was allocated the railway line again. Charlie Snook was allocated some area to the south of Kalgoorlie, but north of Norseman. And Jimmy Woods was allocated some area to the south of Kalgoorlie. And so they all took off on Saturday morning to search in their allocated areas. On Saturday afternoon, the Hawker Demons arrived, and the search was voluntarily underway. Charlie Snook had Constable McCarley on board as an observer. Some years ago, I got in touch with Constable McCarley's daughter, who lived not far from me, but I didn't get a chance to talk to her because she was too ill. The other aircraft all carried observers, and mainly with binoculars so they could have a good look at the terrain. It was assumed that the Fliers, that if they were still alive, would be really suffering from the lack of food and fluids. Charlie Snook flew south of Kalgoorlie to Widgymiltha. He then flew east of Widgymiltha, and about 50 miles ahead of him he saw some smoke rising from a lake, and he thought this is worth investigating. So he flew over, and on the edge of the lake was the aircraft. And that photograph that we saw, was taken by McCarley or Snook as he overflew the aircraft. Etched onto the sand was the word water, and the two Dutchmen were desperately in need of it. So that's them. Snook dropped 2 containers of water and 2 packages of sandwiches and food, and they are most grateful to receive that. Snook also dropped a note saying that help was on its way and would be there in a few hours' time. On his return to Kalgoorlie, Snook overflew a small town and dropped a note there and said, "Would you advise Kalgoorlie that I've discovered the aircraft and get the people on the ground to assemble and be prepared for an all-out effort to pick up the Dutchmen." And so when Snook arrived at Kalgoorlie, everyone was virtually on the ground and ready to move into the search or the pickup. So the news was reported that they were found, and it was decided that the Dragon would be the best aircraft to go and pick them up because it had the most seats. It could fit 6 people on board. Snook's aircraft could fit 2 people as well as the pilot, and other aircraft were pretty limited in the way they could put people on board. So it was decided that Jimmy Woods would take the Dragon out and Charlie Snook would fly over the top and keep an eye on things. And so if the Dragon went through the lake surface and tipped over or anything like that, Snook would see this and be able to go back to Kalgoorlie and say we're in trouble. So Jimmy Woods carried out a skillful landing by testing the surface, putting one wheel on and then seeing if the surface was hard, which it was. So he landed, but he didn't land right up against the hornet moth. He had to land a fair distance away. And so fuel was transferred to the Dutchman's Hornet, but it took a lot of time. And so in the meantime, this is in the afternoon, time's going on, the sun's getting further and further across the sky towards the horizon, and then the transfer of fuel really delayed things even further. So Jimmy Woods took off with the Dutchman for Kalgoorlie, and he was battling last light. And Bob Giles, who was an observer in the Dragon with Jimmy Woods, flew the Foxmoth out once the fuel had been put into it. The aircraft got about half to three-quarters of the way back to Kalgoorlie and the sun disappeared below the horizon. And so there were three aircraft in the dark. Jimmy Woods was out in front, Bob Giles was trying to keep up, and neither of them knew where Charlie Snook was, who seemed to be out the back somewhere and maybe up higher than them. But if you, under those conditions, get higher than the other aircraft, they blend in with the darkness of the vegetation. So you've really got to start changing your altitude. So they got back to Kalgoorlie, and Bob Giles ended up landing in the dark. They had a flare path, and that made it easier. The news the next day in the Sunday Times was that Captain Snook had found the Dutchman, and they were safe and well, had been returned to Kalgoorlie. They're the people who were involved in the rescue. They're the Dutchmen, showing the effects of the sun. This person is the shell manager. This is George Lewis, and that's Bob Giles, that's Charlie Snook, and that's Frank Colopy, the Department of Civil Aviation's representative who was overlooking things.
It'd be Jimmy Woods, Brian?
Yes, Jimmy Woods. And this bloke seriously questioned Bob Giles for landing at night. He said, "Do you have a night rating?" Bob said, "No." That was my first ever. So after 4 days recuperation, the Dutchmen decided that they would go fly back in their aircraft and locate the baggage that they left behind, because they had passports and official documentation and clothes. So they flew around, they couldn't find it. So they had to, in fact, buy new clothes and new equipment. Passports and official paperwork was lost at the same time. So the Dutchmen continued their journey around Australia and arrived safely back in the Netherlands East Indies about a month after they'd set out. The Dutchmen were very thankful to Charlie Snook, who found them, and they arranged a special gift. Some months later, Governor-General of Western Australia, Sir James Mitchell, presented Mr. Snook with a gift. And that's photo at the presentation. That's the Governor and his wife, that's Charlie Snook, and this is some of Snook's relations. The gift that was presented to him was a car. It was a Chev Sports Coupe, the most expensive in the line. And this had been arranged, first of all, for Charlie Snook to fly or go to the Netherlands, East Indies, and receive the car there. But he was too busy with his new airline and couldn't make it, so they sent the car to Perth, and it was presented to him at Sydney Atkinson's. And there was a plaque on the dashboard beneath the steering column, and that's the explanation of why it was presented, why the car was presented. So that's the story of the Lost Dutchman.